Hi, I'm Mike, one of the pastors here at Kings Harbor. Thanks so much for joining us for our online gathering, and thank you so much for being a part of this specific series called Have You Heard the News? Our hope is that you would joyfully depend on the gospel of Jesus Christ because of what you're hearing. With that in mind, we want to, one, share some ways that you can prepare your heart, and two, we want to share some ways that you can take next steps to go deeper in your journey with Jesus Christ. So first, we recognize that being in a house with different household members, maybe even pets, digital devices, all of those can be distractions. And so before we get started, pause. Turn off the other devices besides the one that you're watching on. Make sure everybody's settled in and have what they need. Maybe having a physical Bible and a journal helps you to lock in a way that you might not if you're just kind of watching the screen. And so we want to help you settle in and ask the Lord to speak to you specifically before we start hearing the Word of God. And then second, we just want to recognize that this is a resource. It's not a replacement for being connected to the people of God. In fact, this is just a starting point of the journey. There's so much more to following in the way of Jesus than just hearing a sermon on a weekend. And so even at the end of the message, we're going to give you some ways that you can take next steps to connect and to begin to follow after Jesus in obedience. Until then, we're excited for you to hear what the Lord is going to speak through His Word.
Church, usually as we enter into the message, I say, good morning to you, good to be worshiping with you online. And I want to say all those things, and I mean all those things, but I also want to point to something, particularly if you're watching this on Sunday when it goes live. I just wanted to point you to an opportunity for us to come together and pray. And so this evening, if you're watching it on Sunday, we're going to have what we're calling Dwell at Home. And it's an opportunity for us to come together and pray and worship. And that's just going to be our focus. It's not an information meeting. It's not a training meeting. It's just an opportunity for the people of God to come together and depend on the Lord. And I think it's going to enrich your soul and your life, particularly because today represents Pentecost Sunday. And what better way to honor that day than to be together, waiting on the Spirit of the Lord to breathe life into us. And so I want to invite you to that. And then I also think confession is good for the soul. And so let me just start with a little bit of confession. I'm a nerd. And as I say that, like, I know right now there's this thing that's happened in culture where we've got nerd culture and it's kind of cool. And so I'm not talking about like you like Stranger Things and you're into 80s stuff. I'm talking about like you're obsessively into things and information about things in ways that people are like, I don't want to talk to you about that. And some of you, as I talk about that, you're like, no. And some of you are like, well, I'm glad you have some self-awareness. We've known that for a long time. And so here's why I'm telling you that. Because there's things in my life that I'm just obsessive about. And one of those things is McDonald's. And so I grew up, and McDonald's was just fundamental to really important moments in my life. When things were difficult in our house, like oftentimes my parents would say, hey, let's not worry about making dinner. They would take us to go to McDonald's. Or if some big milestone happened, my parents would be like, hey, let's go to McDonald's. When I turned 16 and got my license, the first thing I did is I drove to go get McDonald's. My freshman year of college, I didn't get the freshman 15. I got the freshman 25 because I was too small as an athlete. And they're like, you need to put on weight and you need to put on a bunch of pounds quickly. And so I ate McDonald's almost every day. I had a Big Mac without cheese, supersized fries, an orange high C, 2 regular hamburgers, and an orange McFlurry all the time. And so there's this kind of sentimental relationship for me with McDonald's. And I say that because you need to understand the nerdiness that I live in, because I listen to podcasts about how McDonald's French fries are no longer as good as they could be. Like, I've carved out 50 minutes of my life to listen to how beef tallow, it used to be the way that they used to fry their fries. And now that they don't do that, it's not as good. I can remember when they stopped doing apple pies fried and started doing baked apple pies. If I cared about my health, I wouldn't be eating McDonald's. And so there's this reality that I can just kind of be nerdy about this, but I bring that to the table because it means something for me. It's sentimental for me. It's something that I go back to. And even on hard days, like, my mind wants to run to McDonald's as a comfort place and comfort food, because there's something about what that was for me that I want to run to. And I know some of you, you're like, we're from Southern California and In-N-Out's better. I hear you, and I don't care. Don't send me that email, because McDonald's means something to me. There's some nostalgia there that I know it's not as good, but I remember it being better than what it is. So why would I tell you that? Because I think one of the things that we're going to see as we enter into the word today is that there's a tendency not just for people to do that with things like McDonald's, but to do that with the Lord. And in particular, there's ways that people do that with the evidence of the Lord's grace, and we hold on to that, and sometimes we can miss him. And so with that in mind, let me give you the table of contents and the main idea. First, the main idea. The gospel of Jesus Christ brings proper meaning to our past, purpose for the present, and hope for our future. And then what we'll look at is we're going to look at this picture of flourishing in the midst of slavery. And then we're going to see grace be announced to the people of God, grace be accepted by the people of God, and then grace be abused by the people of God. And so we'll be in Exodus 19. Let me pray, and then we'll jump right in. Jesus, I thank you. I thank you for your word. I thank you for you. I thank you that you, and because of your life, your death, and your resurrection, that all that's behind me has more meaning, and all that I stand in this moment has purpose. It's not just floating through time, and then what's ahead of me has a more certain hope because of what you've accomplished. Help us to see that and trust you in that way. It's in your name I pray. Amen and amen. So I mentioned through the table of contents that we'll be thinking about flourishing in the midst of suffering. And so like we've done each week in this series, we've been walking through the biblical covenants as this kind of backbone or this table of contents for understanding how the message of the gospel, the news that we're asking week after week, have you heard, that these covenants help kind of structure things that are being revealed about us and how those things can't hold the weight of our joy or our dependence in the way that the gospel can. And so we've talked about week to week. We started with just the general idea of what the gospel is and what that means for us and how we can depend on that out of Romans. And then we have moved through biblical covenants, and we walked from Adam to Noah. And last week we went from Noah to Abram. And now we're going to go from Abram to Moses or to Israel. And we'll enter into what some have called the Mosaic covenant, some have called the Sinai covenant, some have called the Israelite covenant. All those different names point to the same thing, but there's a journey of flourishing in the midst of hard circumstance that connects them. And so last week, one of the things that we saw was in Genesis chapter 15, God was making a promise to Abram, and he had already made a promise about a dynasty or offspring, but then he makes a promise about land or dwelling that he's pointing them to. And so hear what he says. Verse 7, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. And he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. And we talked about last week what this ceremony means and what the significance of that was. And as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they'll be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possession. And I want you to circle that, because we're actually going to come back to that here later in the message, because it's actually a really important phrase. And so the Lord tells him, I'm going to do what I promised, but it's not going to come in the package that you think that it's going to come in. There's going to be this flourishing for your people, but it's going to happen in the midst of it. The way it says it in the text is serving, but it's actually slavery to another nation. And so here's what happens. We see the dynasty promise being fulfilled. Abram has a son, Isaac. Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob has 12 sons that become a nation, and also daughters on top of that. And so they begin to flourish as a people. And one of those sons, Joseph, who is sold into slavery by his brothers, ends up rising to this place of dominion, this place of authority in Egypt as the second in command. And the Lord uses him to save his people, and they move to Egypt in the midst of a famine, and they begin to flourish. So much so that when you get to Exodus chapter 1, it says that they had become so numerous and so mighty that the new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph after he died, said, hey, we've got to do something with these people because they're about to be a problem. And so he enslaves them, and they are in the midst of slavery. And then what we'll read from there on is he begins to become so insecure and intimidated and wicked that he's causing genocide for a generation of young boys. That he's doing all of these things to try and limit these people. And the Lord continues to grow them and strengthen them and deliver them to the point where we get to Exodus 15. The Lord opens the Red Sea, swallows them up, or swallows Egypt up after the Israelites walk through free. And he's done this miraculous initial step of moving them towards the land that he promised them. And then as we get to Exodus 19, it's no longer just this, you have come out of slavery, what's next? It's the Lord announcing his grace in a way that grabs Israel's attention. So Exodus 19, starting in verse 1, would say this. On the third new moon after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out for Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." And so it's an interesting moment here because they've come out. They're on the other side. It's been several weeks. If it's 3 new moons, it seems like it's 3 months since that's happened. And we've seen some ups and downs in them. And we'll even talk about that in a little bit of they're complaining, they're groaning, they're looking back, wanting what they used to have. And in the midst of that, they're encamped around the mountain. And the Lord speaks to Moses and says, hey, here's what I want you to tell the people. You yourself experience my deliverance. And so it's interesting that the Lord initiates in 2 ways here. One, he initiates the present conversation. They weren't seeking him, asking him, what's next? How do we do this? You made some promises to our forefather Abram, and we're 400 years later, but we need to know how you're going to do this. They don't actually ask him for anything. He just enters into the conversation in the midst of their grumbling, in the midst of their complaining, in the midst of their what seems to be distractedness, just being camped around the mountain. He says to them, you yourselves know the way that I delivered you, that like I bore you up on eagle's wings, that I rescued you out of something that you couldn't get out of before Egypt. And so he initiates the conversation, but he also initiates this relationship, this covenant, this grace, that one of the things that we recognize here when we even think about a theology of salvation is that we often lean on the weight that the Lord initiates because there's never a covenant that we start with him. He always initiates with us. And so he initiates with them, saying to them, hey, you see what I've already done on your behalf. Here's the grace, the love, the kindness that I've put up front for you, that I've offered to you, that you did not earn, that it was just me showing my kindness and my power on your behalf. And he says, so because of that, I want to call you to keep my commands and keep the covenant, obey my voice and keep the covenant. And so he calls them to, I've already been gracious to you, but if we're going to live in covenant, now there's this obligation. I've already shown my hand. I've already shown my side of the covenant. And we talked about this all throughout the series, this definition of a covenant being a chosen relationship between 2 parties who make binding promises to each other. He's already shown his commitment to the obligation to be their Lord, to care for them, to deliver them, to provide for them, to protect them. And he says, and now your part of the covenant is to obey my voice, to keep the covenant. But it's not just this initiation of the Lord's grace, and it's not just the covenant conditions that they have to follow, but there's this picture of purpose and identity for them in the present. So step back. Imagine being 400 years of a people with no land, with no authority, with very few possessions, and you come out of that. Who are you now? Imagine that your days were filled with Pharaoh or those who worked with Pharaoh telling you that you need to do this, that you need to make more bricks, but I'm giving you less straw. Imagine your days were filled with moments like when Moses went to Pharaoh and said, hey, can we leave to go worship our God? And he said, no, I'm not going to give you permission to do that. Imagine living with that level of lack of direction, purpose, identity. And imagine the Lord saying to you, not only have I brought you out, not only am I giving you some obligations and promises to be a part of, but I'm also giving you a purpose and identity that you have never had before, that I'm calling you to be my treasured people amongst the nations, that I'm calling you to be my kingdom of priests, that I'm calling you to be my holy nation, to be set apart so that the world can look and see the goodness of God through his people in a really unique way, in the same way that Adam was called to display the image and the authority of God, and Noah was called to display the image and authority of God, and Abram was called to display the blessings of God. This group of former slaves who may not have known who they were given this picture of who they were to be by the Lord. And this is a picture of grace being announced on them. And in the midst of this, they hear the Lord's promise. They hear the way that he speaks and encourages them. And here's how they respond. They accept his grace. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded. And I just see in my mind Moses going up the mountain, coming back down the mountain, going up the mountain, coming back down the mountain. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and may also believe you forever. And so this moment where the Lord spoken to Moses, Moses goes back to people and says, hey, here's what the Lord said. You know the ways that I delivered you, the way that I dealt with Egypt, the way I delivered you on eagle's wings and drew you to myself. You know the ways that I'm now calling you to obey my voice and to keep the covenant. You know that now because of this, you're going to be my treasured possession, that you're going to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. That's what the Lord said. And they're like, oh, we're in. We'll do it. Whatever he says, we'll do it, which is kind of silly because they haven't heard what that commitment looks like. They just know that they have to live out one, but they're like, we're in. We understand what he's done. We understand the way that he's delivered us. I'll use the words from Exodus chapter 6. We've seen how he stretched out his mighty hand against our enemies. We'll trust him. We're in. And the Lord said, okay, I want to make sure, so I'm actually going to come near. I'm going to come close. I'm going to let them see me speaking with you. So not only that they're not just hearing from you secondhand, but they're hearing you here, but they're also going to believe you because they're going to see my power for themselves. And so Israel responds in this moment with this unity and this affirmation. It's actually pretty rare that they are all on the same page at the same time and get it. But in this moment, they're like, we trust your authority, God. We trust your works. We trust your grace. We receive that grace. We're in. And then over the next several chapters, he explains this is what being in looks like. And so Exodus 20 is the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments are these timeless words of law and morality that are being placed before these people. Like there's no context for thou shalt not steal. It's you should just never steal. But then what follows in chapters 21 through 23 are like these case studies that build out the understanding of those things, of what it means to live by those commands. And so it's like these are timeless principles that you must always follow. And then what follows is here's how that applies in this section of your life, in this section of your life. And so he's giving them this comprehensive understanding that's to obey my voice and to keep my law, for you to be faithful to me and also for you to be faithful in your relationships to one another. But this is what you must do. And then Exodus 24 comes, and there Moses is before them, and they enter into this covenant ceremony. In Exodus 24:3, it would say it this way. Moses came and told all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and so the 10 Commandments and the multiple chapters of applied explanation. And it says, all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So they said it before they knew what they were committing to. And after they heard all the commitment, they're like, we're in. We'll commit to that. We are a part of that. And then what follows is a covenant meal and this covenant ceremony of throwing blood. And we actually preached about that in October 2017 in a message called Sacred Vows. And so we'll connect you to that if you want to hear more details about what that covenant ceremony looked like. But what I want you to capture is they didn't accept this grace like we don't know what's going on. They accepted this grace like we trust you because what you've already done. And then in this moment, after you've told us what you're asking us to do as a binding promise, we're in. And then the next several chapters move into them preparing for his presence, donating things for a sanctuary, building the Ark of the Covenant, consecrating themselves. Like from 25 all the way to 31 is this picture of the ways and the people who are doing what it takes to prepare themselves to have God's presence in their midst. And I would love to say it feels like he's come to them and said, I want you to be my representatives in the world like Adam was. And now, like we're restoring Eden, I'm going to be among you. And then Exodus 32 happens. That grace that has been announced and accepted is abused. Exodus 32, starting in verse 1, would say this. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together Aaron and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what's become of him. And so hear what they're saying. They're like, Moses is taking too long. We're in this moment of uncertainty. We've got to find something to put our hope in. Hey, Aaron, go make us something. Go give us something to worship because we don't know where Moses is at. And Moses was our link to God. It wasn't our own link to God. And so Aaron said to them, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said that these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And Israel, this is not actually terribly uncommon with Israel. They often forget the Lord's faithfulness. I mentioned this, that in Exodus 15, they're singing of their deliverance because the Lord's opened up the Red Sea for them to pass through and closed it on their enemies, Egypt. And then in Exodus 16, they literally say, we don't have anything to drink or eat. We wish we were back in Egypt because we had full meat pots then. And there's a part of this like, you do realize that you were in slavery when you were back in Egypt. It doesn't matter that the menu was good. You didn't have any freedom. But they were uncertain, so they forgot the Lord's faithfulness. We'll see it again all the way in Numbers chapter 11. They've just had this moment where they've arranged the camp. In fact, back in February, we preached on Numbers 10 about all that it took for them to arrange the camp and to move when the Spirit of the Lord moved. And they were following the movement of the Lord. And the minute they find some controversy and some uncertainty, they're like, we wish we could go back to Egypt. Like there, we had leeks and onions and we had all of these flavorful things. We wish we could be where we once were. And so it's not uncommon for them to forget the faithfulness of the Lord, but it feels like this is more than just forgetting. This is a step further where they've taken the goodness of the Lord and they've made it this nostalgic idol that they're worshiping. So let me flesh that out. What it says that happens is they come to Aaron and say, hey, you need to make gods for us because we don't know where Moses is, and he's taken too long. And so Aaron says to them, hey, go get all your gold rings. Let's back up to the promise that Abraham received. The Lord said, hey, your people are going to be enslaved for 400 years, and I'm going to bring great judgment against the nation that's against them. And when they come out, they're going to have these great possessions as evidence of the way that I delivered them. So in this moment, those gold rings that they were wearing in their ears that are evidence of the Lord's faithfulness to deliver them have moved from being an evidence of the Lord's faithfulness to them saying, let's make these into our gods because we want to worship this because we don't know where he's at. Think about the audacity to take what the Lord has done that's good on your behalf and say, we don't want you, we want this. Literally what's happening in this text is that they're taking the goodness of God and the evidence of that grace, and they have now exalted it to be this idol of their past and said, these are the gods that delivered us, after they just said 2 times, Lord, you're the one that delivered us and we're committed to you. That's mind-blowing. They're not just forgetting. They're worshiping the goodness that God has given them versus worshiping the Lord himself. They're holding on to these things and exalting them to be a thing that comforts their heart as opposed to trusting the Lord who's been their deliverer and provider and comforted their hearts. So I want to apply this to us. I've talked a lot about the sweep of the Israelite covenant and how we got there, but what does that mean, and how do we see the gospel in that? And particularly if our main idea is that the gospel of Jesus brings proper meaning to our past, the purpose for our present, and hope for our future. How does that cohere with what we've just heard about Israel? It's interesting because they misunderstood their past, and they often looked at it and said, this was a good thing that we want to go back to. And so they didn't understand the goodness of the Lord in that way. They certainly didn't have a good understanding of their present because of the way that they often flaked and failed in the midst of their uncertainty, and they certainly didn't have a full understanding of the future that he was promising them. And so how does the gospel transform that for us? The Apostle Paul helps us with some of the language that he uses. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is a letter that he's been writing, and he's answering some questions from them. And he's talking about proper worship, and he's talking about the ways that they can use their Christian liberty. He's talking about marriage. He's talking about the way that the Spirit operates. He's talking about what love looks like. He's working through all these things. And after 14 full chapters of having that discussion, obviously he didn't write in chapters, but the way we read it, 14 full chapters, chapter 15, all the way that he's been in, he's like, now I remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. And it's interesting that the way that he says it, and he'll say in the next verse, this is of first importance. But it's mind-blowing to me that he would say, now let me remind you of what matters the most, this gospel that seems to have this 3/10 work. This gospel that you have received, past tense, it's already happened for you. It's done something with your past in your past. This gospel in which you stand, it's the thing right now that gives you the ability to straighten your back up and be faithful under the weight of the pressure of the world. And it's the thing that you're looking to that's ultimately going to save you. That the gospel of Jesus Christ, that it changes your past, not because it changes the details of the story, but it brings this meaning to that story that would not be there if it was just left to our own abilities. That's why there are people that their past all of a sudden becomes this passport into other people's pain, because the things that they went through that the Lord has redeemed, they can relate in a way that's not entering into something in their own power, but trusting the gospel of Jesus to be displayed in the way that he delivered them in their past. That it's the thing that is true for our present. There's a pastor named J.D. Greer that he says the gospel is not just the diving board that you jump off of, but it's the pool that you dive into. It's the thing that you're constantly in, being reminded of what Jesus did on our behalf to take the weight and the wrath of our sin and his power over that sin and death proved by his resurrection, that's not something that you mature out of. That's something that you constantly stand on and run to. And that the way that the Bible thinks about salvation, it's not just that you raised your hand in a service, but on that day when the Lord comes to grab his people, that salvation from the Lord's wrath of those who are wicked, that moment is the full fulfillment of your salvation. It's the thing that you look forward to in being saved. And so here's why that's important. The arc of God's work is taking us from old to new and not the other way. That the arc of what God is doing through redemption in Jesus Christ is taking us from that past into our present to the future. And if we get that backwards, it's actually going to harm us, not help us. So, again, confession's good for the soul. When I was early on in my ministry career, a man who was one of my youth leaders when I was a student, his name was Joe Johnston. He owned a construction company, and he did a really great, faithful job of the men that he worked with. He would bring them to church that they might know Jesus. And so one weekend I had preached in the main services of the church that I was at the time in Oklahoma. And one of the guys that he worked with wanted to meet me afterwards. And he's like, man, I'm so fired up about you. It's exciting. And he's like, you know what? You know what would really help you as a preacher? You need a good catchphrase. And I was like, what? He's like, you need a good preacher catchphrase. He's like, here's what I think you should say. Tell the truth and shame the devil. And like I would try and work it into sermons, and it just didn't work. It wasn't a good catchphrase. But I'll tell you what did become my catchphrase. Never let your history be the enemy of your destiny. And like I thought that was some cool stuff to say and throw into sermons. And there's some merit and some truth to that what you were in the past shouldn't diminish who you will be in the future. But here's where that's broken. That sounds like it's all on you. The reality is that the gospel, the message of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, the bringing of the kingdom, the way that he's making not just you new, but all things new, that's actually the reality that takes your history and doesn't make it this side note that you don't want people to see, but it actually makes it part of the story of the arc of God's redemptive work into your destiny. I love the way the scriptures speak because over and over again, it kind of pushes us to say, no, don't keep thinking about the way things were, but start thinking about the way things will be. That it's moving from old to new, that it's moving from old covenant to new covenant, that it's moving from old creation to new creation, that's moving from the old you to the new you. And that's why Paul would say things like, I don't have to be ashamed of my former self because that former self is what the Lord is using to cause the redemption among you. That he could say, I can forget those things that are behind and push to those things that are forward. That he could say that all the old things have passed away and all things have become new. That there's this arc of what God's doing, that we're not just trying to get back to where we once were, but the Lord's trying to get us to something newer and better. So let me apply it to the world that we live in now. That it can be really easy for us, moving into the teens of weeks that we've been in quarantine, to say, I just can't wait until I get back to the way things were. And that's never been the arc of the Lord's redemptive story. He's not trying to make the things the same. He's trying to make things new. And what we see in the gospel is it brings meaning to that old. It gives us stability in the present, and it gives us hope for the future. Second thing that I'll say, because you're hearing me and you're like, but I've read my Bible, and it constantly is telling me to remember, to think back, to remember. And so what you just said sounds like it's wrong for me to look back. It's wrong for me to think about the way things were. That you even point to this picture that it seems like Israel manipulated past grace and tried to make it future hope. And you're saying that that's not the arc of what the Lord does. So help me understand that, because my Bible tells me to remember a lot. And so let me say it this way. The difference between nostalgia and gratitude is hope. Both of them are backward-looking things that say there's something significant that happened behind me. But the difference between one and the other is hope. Because nostalgia says that was the best that things were ever going to be, and I need to stay there. And gratitude says, because the Lord was faithful there, I can be confident and joyful and thankful of what he'll do next. So let me give another example. When Sky and I were dating before we got married, some of you don't know this, some of you do. We dated for 5 years and we broke up 4 times in 5 years. One of those times that we broke up, she was getting ready to go study abroad for a year in Spain. And so we were at our going away party, and she was letting me know that she wanted to break up. And so I did what any self-respecting person who felt like they were in love with a girl would do. I cried and I groveled and I begged, and she didn't break up with me that night. And then a few weeks later, when she was in Spain, she broke up with me. And so at the time, I was working at a church in Dallas called North Place, and I did the video announcements as part of my job. And so there's a guy on staff named Trent Chambers. He wasn't on staff, but he was just close to the staff. His name was Trent Chambers, and he was the guy that did the video announcements. And so every Wednesday morning, Trent would come in and we would set up the green screen and we'd film and we'd do the whole thing. And so when Trent walked in that morning, I was just not in a good place. I was just undone. I was just messed up. It was within a few days of having heard that breaking up news from Sky. And he started asking me what was going on, what was wrong. And I just began to tell him what I was feeling, what I was going through. And he said, the reason that you're stuck in this moment is that you don't believe that the Lord's going to do something better for you on the other side of this horizon. You're stuck here because you don't have hope for tomorrow. And I'm all like wiping my eyes. I'm like, Trent, I need you to get out of my business so we can shoot these announcements. But there's something deep about understanding that there's nothing wrong with appreciating what the Lord had done in the past, as long as I don't exalt that to this level of being the only thing that the Lord will ever do, because then it moves from gratitude to idolatry. And oftentimes we can abuse grace because we'll make the object of the grace the thing that we worship instead of the giver of the grace. And that can happen in a lot of ways. That can be common grace. And so for some of us, our hearts have worshiped our job. Our hearts have worshiped that number in our retirement account. Our hearts have worshiped that we were going to get our kids to be in the right school or have the right things. Our hearts have worshiped that relationship that we're in, that we believe that the Lord gave us, but we're holding on to that so tightly, and we think that that's all the Lord is going to do. But those are common graces that he gives us that don't have anything to do with our salvation, but there are times where we'll take those rings out of our ears proverbially and say, this is the thing that makes me okay. And then on the flip side, there are things even in our spiritual relationships with the Lord and with others that we exalt to this place of being of utmost importance and saying, you can't change that. That sometimes it's the personality of a person in a place in ministry that I'm only okay if I've got that person. Or sometimes it's a program, or sometimes it's a location. That there are things that we hold on to that are good graces from the Lord that we've used like rings out of our ears and said, melt them down so I can worship them. And I just want to guard our hearts against that, because none of those things can hold the weight of your joy. None of those things can hold the weight of your dependence. None of those things can ultimately bring the full meaning to your past of what the Lord allowed you to walk through, that he could redeem you. None of those things can give you the stability to stand in the midst of uncertainty today. And certainly none of those things are going to be your future hope. I've heard a preacher say it this way: nobody has U-Hauls at funerals, because all that common grace stuff can't go with you. And even the good things that the Lord is doing through his people, through programs in the church, through relationships and places and locations, even those things, they are good things, but they are not the ultimate thing. That's Jesus. And so today, as you watch this, I want to give you an opportunity to wrestle. Particularly if you're a believer in Jesus Christ and you're like, I'm all in. But what if the Lord begins to jostle some of those things that maybe have moved into this idol of nostalgia place in your life? I want us to wrestle. What are those things maybe that have made us feel like, okay, as long as I have this, I'll be okay? So I'm going to pray in just a moment, and when I do, afterwards, we're going to have an opportunity to reflect, and I just want to continue to encourage you. This is a good time to press in with others. This is a good time for you to see others and to be seen by others. And so we'll have the questions on the screen, and you can pause them as long as you need to really delve in. Maybe this is a good way to reach out to somebody and say, hey, will you listen to this, and can we have the conversation together? But I just want to encourage you. Don't raise to a level of worship things that were maybe a grace from the Lord, but they aren't the Lord. So let me pray, and then you guys can reflect. Jesus, help me. I'm a creature of habit. At the start of this message, in a humorous manner, I tried to talk about my nerdiness and my devotion to McDonald's. But memories never hold the weight of what we truly need in the moment. I've never had a memory of French fries that have filled my stomach when I was hungry. And far too often we are trying to feast off of that which cannot hold the weight of our dependence and our joy. And so help us to see that they're not found in those graces that you gave. They're found in you. Help us to not make an idol out of what you've graciously given us, but instead, may we see it with gratitude and see it with hope that you will do more because you are good and you do good. For those who are watching and maybe they don't know you, Lord, they have an opportunity to start fresh and open their hands of all the things that they've held on to and instead say, no, I want to trust you, Jesus. It's not what I have or what I can do or what I can be. It's me trusting you. And would they know that and hold to that? And then, Lord, would you give us courage and honesty as we speak to one another about what we're experiencing and seeing through your word today. It's in your name I pray. Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us online as we gather around the Word of God. I mentioned earlier that if you are new and looking for ways to connect into the life of the church, we wanted to share a couple of steps. And the first one is this: just below, there's a button, if you're on our website, that says New Here. And we would love to get just a little bit of information on you so we could follow up and get to know you just a little bit better. Also, if you need prayer, we'd love to encourage you in that way. And so there's a button below that says Need Prayer. And if you would utilize that, our team's going to be praying and following up. And then for all of us, whether you're brand new to Kings Harbor or whether you've called this home for a long time, this is just the starting point in the way of following Jesus. We want to encourage you to take next steps as disciples. And if you haven't, one of those steps is being in community with others where you can be shaped and embody the gospel. We're inviting you to trust the Lord and marking that by the act of giving, saying, I trust you to use what I'm giving to multiply your grace to the world. And then we're continually reminding you that when we leave being together, we're not just departing, we're sending. And we're inviting you to be sent to be the Lord's voice declaring his news to the world. We love you and we can't wait to hear what he's doing in your life.